Redditors who have had to take someone's life in self-defense. Did you ever recover psychologically? What is it like to live knowing you have taken someone's life, regardless of you not wanting to do it? Back in 2012, two men busted in my back door. It took them a few minutes as it was a metal door on a metal frame with sturdy hinges and a lock. One of the guys was probably 6'6" and pretty large. He was finally able to break it off the hinge with a crowbar. When I heard them start hammering on the door, I told my wife to call the police and lock herself and our baby behind two doors. I went out into the hallway with a shotgun. I kept yelling at them to leave and that the cops were coming and that I was armed. They kept coming. Eventually I heard a pop and the banging stopped and I knew they were through. I told them in no uncertain terms that if I saw them in my house, I was going to take their lives. A few seconds later, they came around the corner both holding what appeared to be weapons, and I shot the bigger one twice in the chest. The other one just stood there confused, probably trying to process what in the hell just happened. He took one step towards me, and I shot him as well. Police showed up about 2 minutes later. Both perps died at the scene. One had a knife and duct tape, and the other a crowbar. I later found out the larger one was wanted for some sort of manslaughter charge because he had taken his girlfriend's life estate over. I have zero regrets about that night. They had multiple chances to leave, and I have no doubt they would have hurt my family if I had not stopped them. I've really got to respect OP's trigger discipline here. If it went exactly how they described it, and I have no reason to believe it didn't, then they gave ample warning, told them exactly what was going to happen, and they did have a chance to leave. And even the second guy, OP waited until he stepped forward to take the shot. I have a lot of respect for protecting your family and for doing it in such a conscientious way, if that makes sense. Either way, whether you regret it or not, OP, that must have been a horrifying experience to even happen. So at the very least, I'm glad it doesn't seem to be weighing on you too heavily. Story 2. I was jumped by 4 guys about 10 years ago. I was down on the ground and they were kicking and punching me. I grabbed my knife from my pocket, reached up and stabbed one of them in the stomach. Blood everywhere. Some mine, mostly his. They all ran. One of them yelled back that he would find me later and take my life. He died later at a hospital because he took too long to get help. Basically, I never really felt bad about it and I don't regret it. It has popped in my head randomly from time to time and it weirds me out that I took a person's life, but that's about it. Doesn't last long. My thoughts about it are that I was protecting myself, and whether or not they would have ended my life, I feel it was not just justified, but exactly what I should have done. Story 3. My house had been robbed twice while I was at work. One day I had to call out sick, and while I was sleeping I heard someone downstairs. I called out, "Who's there?" When we were sick, our supervisors come to see if we're actually home, but I was worried because they always knock first, and I was sure I didn't hear a knock or a doorbell. I heard footsteps running up the stairs, and I called out I was armed. My supervisor definitely would have stopped, but the footsteps got louder. I got behind the door, and 2 men charged into my room with guns. I moved my arm, and they turned around. I shot one of them in the neck while he shot the wall behind me, and the other man ran downstairs. It turns out I shot my coworker's cousin, who knew my schedule of when I wasn't going to be home. The coworker wasn't in on it or anything. The other man was the cousin's friend. I was not charged. I don't feel guilty because the last 2 months made me feel very violated. I changed jobs because I was uncomfortable working with people who knew about it. Story 4. Afghanistan. Working at the gate to our FOB when a blue van starts to speed up to us, swerving around the C-wire we had put down to make them slow down. It took me a moment to process this guy wasn't going to slow down, and that the van looked sagged and overloaded. Once I put those two together, myself and my A-gunner opened fire with an M240B into his windshield. The guy didn't stand a chance, and his vehicle rolled to a halt about 25 yards away. Called up EOD and they came out and found a 250-pound IED in the back of the van. It was the first time I took someone's life, but I regret nothing about it. It was that sick guy or all of my buddies behind me in the FOB. When I deployed, I told my guys I would make sure all of them made it back alive. Edit. To clarify a couple of questions you guys asked. An FOB is a forward operating base. Think of it like an outpost we stage in and run operations out of. If you have ever been to Iraq or Afghanistan, you know the cars over there are freaking crap. When this van was swerving, you could see the tail end of the van was pretty much dragging in the dirt and came down hard on the suspension with every bump. I took that into account when I was doing my risk assessment. An M240B is a crew-served medium machine gun. It's a badass gun and is only outdone by the 50 cal. And a final note, 22 vets take their own lives a day. Please help bring awareness to this issue, and if you know someone who is struggling, help them. There are far too many good guys who make it home only to lose the struggle. Story 5. I was getting out of the army a few years ago. I took my wife and kids home early in order to focus on getting out and finish selling the house before I completely left the area. I left both of my cars at home with my wife, had a buddy who was also leaving the army who drove me around. So there were 0 cars at my house. Anyway, the front door opened to a hallway to go to the kitchen and back door and the stairs to go upstairs. I was sleeping on the floor in the master bedroom where the top of the stairs led because all my stuff had been packed away except for a few knickknacks. And my .45 Smith & Wesson M&P. 3 guys broke in that night, shattered my back door, big center window in the door, which woke me up. I didn't have much to take, but my laptop and TV were the only things downstairs. I heard them talking, heard them say stuff about not having much and taking the laptop and TV, then heard them talk about looking upstairs. As soon as I heard the first step creak, I yelled out, "I have a gun." No movement. Then they pretty much bum rushed the stairs and into my room. I shot the first guy in the neck. His buddy took a shot at me and missed, where he was then shot in the shoulder. The third guy rushed back outside and left his buddies. The guy shot in the neck was dead instantly. Guy with a gunshot wound in shoulder was writhing in pain. Kicked their guns down the stairs and called 911. Cops were there in about 10 minutes. Took my statement, took my gun, and offered an ambulance. Don't think they ever found the third guy either. 3 years later, I think about it from time to time. What bothers me most is that I didn't take the life of the person I shot in the shoulder, so I fear he could find me again. And also that the house was nearly empty. That dude who did lose his life lost it over nothing. I'm pretty much screwed up in the head from deployments and such, so this just adds on to it. I just smoke a lot of weed to deal with it. Edit. For those that keep asking, yes, I have sought help. I just don't prefer it. Some people take differently to seeing a therapist and whatnot. It's not for me. I found my own way of coping. I don't smoke copious amounts, usually just toke at night to help unwind and sleep. If it happened again, I would do it again in a heartbeat, especially if my family was there. One more thing, thank you all for the support of armed forces, but please, thank your local firemen, police, and doctors. Those people save lives every day. We're only 5 stories in, and we've already had 2 where it was announced someone had a weapon and people still charged forward at them. That blows my mind. And OP's right. Over what? They could have taken the TV and the laptop and just left. Instead, they were reckless, greedy, and just, I don't know, stupid. I hate to hear about situations like this, but I have a feeling it won't be the last in this thread. Story 6. This was about 2004 to 2006. I don't remember the exact year anymore. I took the life of a guy that tried to break into my apartment because he was wanting his wife that he had just beat the crap out of. 2 a.m., I hear them arguing. I could hear it through my bathroom wall. I shut my bathroom and then bedroom to drown it out. 2:15, she's banging on my door. Broken nose, left eye swollen, and limping from tripping and falling to get out of the apartment. Told her to go to the bathroom, clean herself up, and then hide in my bedroom. Husband comes out of the apartment yelling her name, and he notices her blood trail to my apartment. Starts banging on my door yelling to let him in. I warned him 3 times if he doesn't stop, I will take his life. He kicks the lock on the door swings open, and I swing my baseball bat down onto his head. He falls to the ground stunned. He lands stomach first, and I see a handgun tucked into the back of his shirt. I grab it, throw it into my apartment, and warned him 1 more time. He got up and came at me. I slam my bat into his stomach, then slam my bat over his head 1 last time, which caved his skull in. I knew from the blood splatter from when I hit he was dead. Thankfully, the neighbors had called the police when it started, and the second he fell to the ground dead, police had made it to the top of the steps. It never affected me as much as it should have. I reacted the best way I could for the situation I was in. I don't think about what I did anymore. I can't fix the past. Once again, an impressive display of restraint. You disarmed him and gave him 1 more chance to walk away, and he just chose to rush you instead. At that point, taking his life is really the only reasonable thing you can do to defend yourself, because it didn't seem like the man was going to stop no matter what. I'm glad it doesn't affect you, OP. You did a good but very difficult thing here, and it's just unfortunate he didn't leave you any other options. Story 7. Pushed a guy who was attacking me in front of a bus. At the time, I was so completely consumed with rage and fear I couldn't speak. He was going to take my life. It was either him or me. And hey, I picked him. It took him a few weeks to die in hospital, eventually succumbing to pneumonia. I was informed of his death by telephone. I felt nothing. 30 years later, I still don't. He was known to police as an extremely violent offender, and it was highly unlikely he would have stopped being a worthless and dangerous jerk. I felt like I'd provided a public service then, and I still do. I'm normally an extremely friendly, easygoing individual who never uses violence. All of this goes out the window when faced with fighting for your life. Story 8. Back in 1995, I lived in a quiet neighborhood in the SF East Bay with my wife of a few years and our 20-month-old daughter. We had a small 3-bedroom, 2-story house, and one of our second-floor bedrooms doubled as my home office. One quiet Saturday morning, I was in my office playing Command & Conquer on my computer with my headphones on, oblivious to the sounds of the outside world. I'd probably been playing for an hour or so when, during one particularly quiet moment, I faintly heard my wife cry out downstairs. Knowing she was down there with our daughter, I pulled my headphones off to see if she needed help with anything. Until the day I take my last breath, I'll never forget what I heard when I pulled them off. I heard the voice of a man shout, "Quit yelling, woman, or I'll freaking cut your head off and screw your daughter." My daughter was crying hysterically. After that, it was like some switch was thrown in me, and my higher brain just shut off. I wasn't making decisions, I just acted. I don't even remember pulling the .45 from the lockbox in my desk. I just remember walking down the stairs, slowly, scared as hell that I was going to see my wife dead when I reached the bottom. Instead, when I reached the bottom, I saw my wife half naked, bent over the couch, bleeding from somewhere in her upper body, while being assaulted from behind by some burly guy with a knife in his hand. He wasn't trying to assault her, he was actively in the middle of the deed. I never said a word to the guy. Not while I was upstairs, not while I was coming down the stairs, not when I walked into the room. His back was to me, so he had no idea I was even standing there. He was holding his knife in his right hand, so that was the arm I grabbed with my left when I pulled him off. He spun away from her and me with a confused look on his face. I shot him square in the chest at nearly point-blank range before he had a chance to say a single word. His face went pale as he went onto one knee, and I fired twice more. One hit his neck and the second missed entirely. I was told later the first shot was the fatal one. What happened next has always been a point of shame for me. The only thought going through my head at that point was that I couldn't let my daughter watch this man die. Without even checking on my wife, I scooped my daughter up and walked out my front door. As I walked out to my driveway, I saw one of my neighbors standing there staring at my house. He'd heard the gunshots. The poor guy went pale when he saw me walk out, and I vaguely remember asking him to hold my daughter while I went and checked on my wife. The neighbor asked me if I'd shot her, and I told him no. I shot the man who was assaulting her. I didn't realize at the time that I had the guy's blood spray covering half my body and that I looked like something out of a horror movie. I then handed him my daughter and my gun. I have no idea why I gave him my gun, though, and went back into my house to help my wife. The police and DA gave me some flack about the exact circumstances of the shooting. One of the detectives told me it was more of an execution than a defense, but in the end they declined to pursue any charges. The man who attacked her turned out to be a guy with serious mental issues who had previously been convicted of 2 violent assaults, one of which was against a 9-year-old girl. Under California's then new 3 strikes law, he would have gone to prison for life if I hadn't taken it. As for recovery, I like to think that I've recovered from it, but it certainly induced a few behavior changes. To this day, for example, I can't wear headphones that block out background noise. Even after years of counseling, over-ear and noise-canceling headphones give me panic attacks because I can't hear what's happening around me. I found out later he'd been assaulting my wife nearly 10 minutes before I heard him, and that he'd actually told my wife 3 times he was going to assault my daughter when he was finished with her. I was sitting 30 feet away and had no idea it was going on. That fact has screwed with me for years. My wife had a much worse time of it, though. In addition to 2 stab wounds to her shoulder and upper arm and the bruising and injuries from the forceful assault, she ended up having a mental break and took years to really recover. For the first 6 months, she absolutely could not be in any room by herself. For more than a year, she couldn't be in a house by herself, and she never re-entered the house where this happened. For several years, she would break out in a sweat when she heard men with the same accent as the assaulter talking, because she would hear his voice again. Even now, decades later, she starts shaking if you try to talk to her about it. She's fine in every other sense, but even discussing it freaks her out. I get what law enforcement is saying about it being excessive force and more of an execution. It's objectively true, sure, but in a situation like this, I don't know how you could expect any single person on Earth to not react in at least a similar way when the victim is someone they love. What an absolutely horrific act. And what was going through OP's mind, I can only imagine. As much as I understand the legal aspect inside of it, I don't think I could fault OP one bit here, nor would I want to. OP, I wish the best for you and your wife on continued recovery. Something like that doesn't just go away. Story 9. I got assaulted in an alley in New Orleans 20 years ago. The guy hit me in the back of the head, cut me a few times with a knife, put the knife to my throat and told me he was going to assault me and take my life. I choked him to death, felt his windpipe crumble in my hands. I've had PTSD ever since. Constant nightmares. I see his face turn red, blue, and purple. I hear the crunch of his windpipe. I feel him struggle against me. I have scars I see every time I get out of the shower. I did what I had to do, and I don't regret it. But taking a man's life with your bare hands is a lifelong struggle. Story 10. Having lived in a more dangerous neighborhood growing up, I was taught gun safety as a teen, and was at the shooting range regularly with my dad and brothers. One day I arrived home after college to find someone going through my things in my bedroom. He came at me with a knife as soon as he saw me. I pulled my gun out of my purse and shot him in the chest. It happened so quickly. All I could think of was the knife and his proximity and that he had physical advantage over me, and so I needed to do something before he got within arm's length and could use his strength to assault me. I didn't take time to aim. I certainly didn't intend to take his life. I just wanted him to not be able to come anywhere near me. I don't regret pulling the trigger. I do have nightmares about it and what would have happened if I didn't have a gun that day. Story 11. Someone tried to rob me with a knife. I was on my way home from my crappy job at college where I got paid under the table. It was Friday and I was walking the 3 blocks to my house with a wad of cash in my pocket that I needed. He stepped out and waved the knife and told me to empty my pockets. My immediate thought was, hell no, you junkie. My second thought was the words of my friend, a black belt in karate. If you get in a knife fight, don't be afraid to get cut. It's gonna happen anyway. Just don't let it be bad. We were half joking when he said that. When was I ever gonna get into a knife fight? I said no to emptying my pockets. He stepped forward, brandishing the knife. So I threw all 230 pounds of myself at this spindly man that should probably weigh 170-ish, but was instead closer to 140. I did get stabbed. Honestly, with my adrenaline running, I hardly felt it. It felt like a hard punch at first. I eventually tackled him and from on top slammed his head into the sidewalk once and he went limp. He was still alive at the time, although unconscious. The problem was actually that he had started a brain hemorrhage or some sort of brain bleed and died after reaching the hospital. Anyway, right after he went limp, I started to calm down a bit, and I realized my side hurt really freaking bad. Far more pain than I remember ever feeling. That was when I noticed I'd been stabbed, which was weird, because I remember that when I took the slash on my arm it hurt really bad the second it happened. Anyway, I also had a trip to the hospital. Now, to answer your question, I don't really feel bad, and I don't think about it anymore. When I was first told he died, I was a tiny bit saddened, but that only lasted for a short while. It wasn't even because I took his life. It was just because someone died when they didn't have to. But I never blamed myself for it. After all, I didn't put a knife in that guy's hands and tell him to mug someone. The guy's mother was apparently called in at some point or another while I was at the hospital. She came and talked to me. It was odd. She was sad, but she wasn't bitter or anything. She basically knew he was on drugs and had kicked him out of the house about a year earlier. I was more sad for her than anything else, but never felt guilty about it. It was more detached, I guess. I felt sad, but more like the sadness you feel when reading about it in the newspaper, not the kind where you're involved firsthand. I felt sad that she lost a son, and even that feeling left me quickly, but towards the guy himself, I felt nothing. A bonus story about the other time someone tried to steal my crap. I keep opposite hours of my roommate. While he's at work, I'm sleeping. While he's sleeping, I'm at work. Very slight overlap after I get home from work for about an hour to see each other. A year or so ago, someone successfully broke in. It's like 3 a.m. and the dogs start losing their crap. I'm in my bedroom at the computer enjoying a little Diablo 3 Reaper of Souls, which was still pretty new. I take off my headphones and listen. Behind the barking, I hear the sounds of someone walking around quietly, but not quiet enough. I text my roommate, who is asleep. He's a light sleeper and will have his phone right next to him. Then I call the police. I'm waiting in my room and I'm hoping my roommate is awake in his. The operator gives me the whole "don't do anything, police are on the way" spiel. I hear him for a minute in the living room and realize he's probably taking the Xbox 360. Then he starts coming down the hall. Unfortunately, I couldn't telepathically give the message that we should do nothing and wait for the cops to my roommate. The dude rounded the corner and into the hallway and into my room. First room in the hall. When he stepped in, he couldn't initially see me as the bedroom opens up towards the right, the way he was looking, and I was to the left, baseball bat in hand, machete on my hip. He scanned the room and took a step in towards the center. Then my roommate tackled him from behind and that was it. It was over. He sat on his back and held his wrists until police showed up. The guy struggled for a few seconds and gave up quickly. My roommate isn't the strongest guy in the world, but his job is to pick up heavy bricks and move them somewhere, so the guy wasn't going to break free easily. Now, this may come as a shock for people who've been watching the channel for a bit. You probably know me as empathetic, maybe even a softy or whatever. But I will say that in this scenario, I think it's good that OP has a level of detachment. I think that's really important to be able to heal from something like that properly, or to even process it at all. Being able to sort of remove himself from the situation in a way seems to have worked out pretty well for him, which would be bad if he took someone's life and didn't need to. And it's not even like OP went out of his way to like try to end the guy's life. It just sort of happened, a consequence of the situation. And so it's probably a good thing that OP doesn't feel guilt for it. Or if he does, not much. Still just a really crappy situation though. Drug addiction can get really serious and make people do things that are just dumb, I guess. Just really unfortunate. Story 12. When I was 8 years old, we lived out in a farmhouse in an orchard. The nearest town was about 10 minutes away, and my dad was working far enough away that he stayed away during the week. One morning I heard my mom yelling and I thought I had missed the bus, so I got out of bed and saw a naked man hitting her and trying to grab her. He was out in a bender and had just walked to the nearest lights and broken in. Our dog was barking and nipping at him, but she wasn't a trained attack dog or anything. I ran back into my room and grabbed a little .22 bolt action my dad had given me and the ammo he made me keep separate and loaded it. It seemed like it took forever to load those 5 shots. I ran outside following the dog barking and saw him dragging my mom by her hair. I remembered trying to be steady like I had been taught, but I just fired over and over again. I didn't know it at the time, but 3 of the 5 hit him, and he was later found by the police after someone dropped him anonymously at the hospital an hour away, with one of the bullets lodged in his lung. At that age, I had a hard time processing it, mainly because the state mandated I see a counselor and she kept insinuating I should feel all kinds of emotions I wasn't, which made me feel like there was something wrong with me. In the end, I just feel lucky that I was brought up by parents who trusted me and spent time teaching me never to panic. Okay, I have a lot of questions about this one. Does OP mean 18, not 8? Can an 8-year-old even handle a bolt action? I'm not super familiar with guns, frankly, so I don't know. But why would someone give their 8-year-old a gun? It must mean 18, right? And then number 2, dude was dragging your mom away and you shot at him. When you're dragging someone away, they're typically behind you, meaning she was pretty much a human shield for at least half of this dude, I would assume. Taking shots at that seems incredibly risky. OP, I'm not calling your story outright fake, but I have questions, as stated. Story 13. I am a combat veteran. During my military service, I know I took the lives of at least 17 people, and likely many more. I saw the faces of 4 of those 17 as they were dying. I recovered, accepted it, but I will never be okay with it. I can justify it at least half a dozen ways, but in the back of my mind, I know these men and women had families, husbands, wives, children that will never care how well I can justify it myself. They will never forgive me. I know that they're children without fathers, and it is my fault. I have to live with that. So yes, I recovered. I sleep most nights, but nothing can undo what I've done. I will carry the weight of my actions for the rest of my life. Story 14. Very short version of a long, nasty story. I got carjacked almost 25 years ago in Newport News, Virginia, when it was all the rage in certain crap-hole eastern U.S. cities. Instead of just shooting me with a little semi the guy had me drive him to a couple of crack houses, also all the rage 25 years ago, dragged my butt inside 2 or 3, used cash he made me pull out of an ATM to buy for him, back in the car for another go-around. Seems like this went on all night, but it was probably only an hour or 2. Regardless, at some point the guy started to bug out, and wasn't paying attention to me when we got back in the car for round number whatever. My tire iron was under the front seat of my car. I flat out smashed his face in with it, heard bone break, blood all over, the whole nasty deal. Pushed him out the door and drove home. Honestly, I puked a bunch, got crap-faced drunk, puked some more, raged quite a bit, and then passed out. Never called the cops, never got questioned, and talked about it with only a couple of friends. In the first couple of days when the adrenaline was coming down, it felt like it was going to destroy me. But since then, I haven't thought about it that much. It's possible I didn't end his life, although I doubt it, and I always assumed he died. Sounds weird, but I haven't lost much sleep over it either. I'm fairly certain he would have taken my life if I hadn't hit him. Anyhow, it lurks in the back of my thoughts, and if nothing else, I know that I could take someone's life if necessary, because I certainly did try with that guy, and to the best of my knowledge, I succeeded. Story 15. My senior year of college. I had an off-campus apartment in a really crappy part of town. I often went to the batting cages with my roommates just for fun, so we each had our own baseball bat. It was a Friday night and I heard a bang at the back door. I honestly thought it was just one of my roommates who had locked themselves out drunkenly. Well, I get down there and there's a guy in the kitchen wearing a ski mask. I just grabbed one of the baseball bats and swung at this guy as hard as humanly possible. Well, I hit the guy square in the head. He fell back, broke down the sliding closet door. Two of my roommates came running out, and I was just standing over this guy who was profusely bleeding on our kitchen floor. One called 911 and the other took off the guy's ski mask, and we tried to stop the bleeding with it. At this point, the lights were still off, and I didn't realize how much blood was everywhere. Two cops show up what felt like an eternity later, and then an ambulance wheeled him off. He died not too long after that. Our last roommate showed up while police were still taking statements. He just walks in and gives us this look like, what the hell happened? And I just said, I broke your bat. Sorry. He didn't really give a crap about the bat. I just didn't know what else to say. None of us slept that night. We just watched South Park on Netflix and all called out of work the next day. I remember there was a lot of disbelief. I mean, I couldn't believe that had just happened. Never felt bad about it, though. I did often wonder for a while what led the guy to break into our place. I do, however, own a .22 revolver now. Story 16. Happened about a decade ago. I was walking back home and these two kids tried to rob me. I don't necessarily know what age they were, but they were somewhat short. I live in a country where the average person isn't very tall, and they were pretty scrawny. I was pretty deep into depression that had me at a point in which I didn't really care about much of anything, and I was contemplating taking my own life constantly. So as weird as it might be to say, I wasn't particularly scared, which is probably why he kept getting more agitated. Both were probably on drugs. One with the gun was yelling more and more, and for some reason, I reached out for his gun. In the struggle, the gun fired twice. Both times he got shot and died. The other one started yelling for his brother, charged me with the knife he had, and I shot and kept shooting until the gun ran out. Called the police, and they couldn't pretend to care less. Two junkie kids on drugs would probably be different in the US. At the time, the only thing that freaked me out was the fact I wasn't freaking out. I kept thinking I was some kind of monster, yet was mostly indifferent towards it. A year later, I got on meds for my depression, and it felt like it crashed on me pretty hard. Got heavily into drinking. Well, people always say you don't want to mess with a guy who has nothing to lose, but the situation really doesn't come up that often. OP, I hope you're in a better place now. There aren't many words to describe depression that will make it past YouTube's filter or whatever, but basically what I want to say is, yeah, it can suck and just ruin your whole life. So I'm glad you're at least medicated for it now. If you're still heavily into drinking though, I hope you kick that too. Of all the ways to manage heavy feelings, it's not the best one. Story 17. Psychologically it can be a little rough. You have to remember that they're people too, but on the other end of the spectrum, they're there to hurt you and you want to live too. I've done it twice in my life. They both felt different but the same. It's scary knowing that you can actually take someone's life, but also reassuring in case you need to. The feelings are all back and forth. It screws with me sometimes because I usually contemplate what the hell I'm doing with my life. But luckily, I'm pretty good at calming myself down. It's not that I didn't want them to live, it's that I wanted to keep living. Story 18. I'm 5'2" and weigh a little south of 100 pounds. I've always been on the smaller side and I used to always have earphones on. I was always decked out in nicer clothes. Looking back, I was probably an easy target. I've always grown up on the greener grass. My parents are both successful and I'm an only child. It was a huge culture shock for me when I decided to go to college in a not-so-safe area. My school is a fairly high-ranked private school in probably the worst location of SoCal. Really high crime rates and all that fun stuff. I was walking to my apartment after a long day at the library. It was around 1 a.m. or so. I normally drive, but that day I had lent my roommate my car, so I decided to walk to school instead. I could have taken the shuttle, but I figured I should exercise and all that fun stuff. I was young and reckless. I think I was about 10 minutes away from my place when I noticed I was being followed. I didn't think much of it, so I kept going. There are a lot of homeless people in the neighborhood, and they're fairly harmless. I figured it was one of them panhandling or something. What I didn't know was that there was someone else in front that was following me too. The cops said they planned it from the start. I wasn't a random target. They were herding me to a location they wanted me to be in. I don't really remember how it happened, but I turned the corner and everything went black. When I woke up, I was sitting on the floor of the alleyway in the corner, and there were about 3 guys towering over me. 2 of them had knives, and they told me if I screamed, they would make sure the cops wouldn't be able to identify my body. I remember them grabbing me by my hair and dragging me further down the alley, and being forced on the floor on my stomach. One of them held onto my hair and my hands so I couldn't move my head, and I felt a strong pressure on the back of my calves and thighs. I imagine they were probably stepping on my legs so I couldn't move. I remember crying and choking on my snot and tears while trying not to make a sound. I also felt something really cold on my neck. I knew it was the knife, so I kept quiet. They rummaged through my bag and took everything worthwhile and threw the rest into giant trash bins. Whoever was stepping on my legs bent down and started patting me down to make sure I didn't have anything on me worth stealing. They took my iPod, iPhone, and around $200 in cash from my pocket. I felt really strong pressure on my side after that knocked the wind out of me. I felt like I was going to die. I imagine they kicked me. I couldn't curl up into a ball and cry, though. They were still holding on to me. The part after that is a blur. I remember one of the guys saying, "Let's bounce," and another voice saying, "Let's have some fun with her." I think my adrenaline kicked in when I felt pressure on my lower back and someone pulling down my jeans. I started flailing and screaming then. They kicked me a lot more and cut my shoulder from my flailing. I think that scared them. They weren't really planning on hurting me. I got an arm free and grabbed the knife by the blade. I remember it stinging and thinking, yes. It was more of a, I'm still alive, than a, yes, I can hurt these guys. I managed to wrestle the knife away from the guy holding my hair and tried to stab him. I felt some pain in my back, which later turned out to be stab wounds. What they don't tell you in movies is how hard it is to stab someone. I think I tried to stab his legs, his arms, stomach, anything I could reach. I couldn't fully get it in, but I knew he was hurting because he kept screaming. I think when I realized I had done something was when I felt the knife slide in and the other guys yelling and running. When there was no more pressure on me, I looked up and saw that I had managed to stab the guy in the eye. He stopped moving and just fell. I don't know if he was dead then. I want to imagine it was the shock that caused him to pass out. I started screaming and crying and yelling. I think I passed out too. I remember waking up to sirens and going to the hospital. I had multiple stab wounds and had to go through intensive surgery. I also had 3 broken ribs, a crap ton of fractured bones, and all that fun stuff. A couple days later, the detectives on my case told me the guy didn't make it, and they were sorry his crappy ass couldn't rot in prison. I just remember thinking, good, I hope he rots in hell. Story 19. Attempted carjacking by 2 quote-unquote refugees in the wake of a massive natural disaster. Far enough away to avoid being completely destroyed, but close enough that practically all law enforcement and EMS were sent out of the area to assist in the worst spots. Rather unscrupulous individuals took advantage of this. Waves of people fleeing the worst of it, no electricity, awful heat, break-ins, theft, assaults, lady down the street found with her head caved in, a pleasant time. Made a run into town to obtain some supplies and was hauling gas and food back to the house in a pickup. Probably should have covered the bed, but in any case, got jumped at a stop sign by 2 guys, one with a machete and the other with what looked like a high-point handgun, both waving their weapons about and screaming, "Get the hell out of the car," and related pleasantries. Fortunately, the Glock was right in the door. Felt like time slowed down. Remember seeing the gunman's eyes widen at the sight of it. Shot the gunman in the stomach and chest and hit the other in the chin. Bled way more than a deer would. The teeth were rather unpleasant sight, and they never really mentioned people crapping or peeing themselves on death in the movies. Machete died extremely fast. Gunman curled up and was making some kind of noises. Gunshots had screwed up my hearing. Took ages for the deputies and EMS to show up, with the gunman dying shortly after. Cut and dry affair, legally speaking. Deemed clear case of a justified shooting. Didn't exactly shed any tears over them. When you attack someone, that is an outcome you can expect. Been more on my guard in the years since, and had random adrenaline rushes and unprovoked feelings of extreme danger present for a few weeks afterwards. Story 20. This was back in 2003. I was 14 at the time. I was visiting my aunt and uncle in Texas for my 2-week Christmas break. We were all supposed to go out to my cousin's baby shower, but I came down with the chicken pox. Being young at the time, I didn't want to go anyway. I convinced them to go without me. Ended up playing Halo for a few hours in the master bedroom when I heard a window shatter and the alarm start going off. I remembered my uncle kept a gun behind the TV, so I grabbed it. It was some kind of revolver, no idea what kind. All I know is that the hammer was really hard to pull back. What seemed like 5 minutes later, I hear someone coming up the stairs and yelled at him to go away and that I had a gun. Being so young, though, I had the voice of a child, and the guy probably thought I was bullcrapping. When he got to the top of the stairs, I fired once and the recoil made me drop the gun. But I think I hit him somewhere since he fell backward down the stairs. I never found out how the guy died, but I hope it wasn't from the gunshot. I called 911 and sometime later the police came. It turns out that this guy got out of prison a few days before. The guy was a drunk and managed to hit some delivery guy on a bike during one of his drunk driving routines. My uncle was his defense attorney. Turns out it's pretty hard to defend someone when there's security camera footage of you running some guy over and driving away. Guessing he blamed my uncle for the 5 years he spent in jail and decided to get revenge. For some reason, the idea that this was a targeted break-in is scarier to me, because this guy was not there just to steal stuff, I guarantee it. If it was for revenge on OP's uncle specifically, he was looking to do a lot worse. And during the holidays too? Come on, man. Have you no shame? Story 21. My parents went out for date night when I was 10. Got me a babysitter from the neighborhood who was 14 or 15. He'd been my babysitter a few times before. I always wanted an older brother. Both of my parents worked and my brother was 7 years younger than me, so I never got to have much playtime. He and I would play video games, play with Lego, stuff like that. It was a lot of fun. This night, he tried to assault me. He got on top of me and started touching me. He wasn't much bigger than me, so I was able to get away. We were in the TV room and I ran to my room on the other side of the house. I got my baseball bat and hid behind the door. When he came in, I hit him in the knees and he fell down. I just kept hitting him on the ground. Don't know how long. Eventually, I ran away and called the police and told them to come over. I remember being really scared he was going to get up and chase after me when I was making the call. Once the call was done, I went over to watch him and I realized he was dead. His face was all mushed up and bleeding, but he still looked surprised. Not really recovered psychologically. I try not to think about it too much, but I end up thinking about it a lot, actually. Story 22. Drove up and this dopehead had drawn a knife on my roomie in his car. Was in the process of robbing him. Took out the CCW, approached and drew down. Told him to drop the knife and get the hell out. I had 911 on speaker. He sees me, makes eye contact, and I knew he was a spun monkey. He freaking growls, slashes my roomie and turns on me. I double tapped him. He spun around, took about 4 steps and crumpled. I remember the smells of sulfur, blood, and the thud the bullets made. What I never heard or don't remember is the gun going off. I remember making the choice to fire. I have lucid memories of the flash lighting up the scene and his face, but everything was on mute. I do feel bad. He was an addict, which I consider a disease, and I wish he didn't die, but he shouldn't have put me in the situation he did. Stay off dope, kiddos. Story 23. I was in an incident where I shot and took the life of a squatter during an eviction. In all honesty, he shot me first, and I don't really remember all the details, which is probably a good thing. I was also present with a marshal at the time, so there wasn't much of a report to take. I think about it sometimes, especially when my shoulder hurts. Hard not to, honestly. I'm alive, and he isn't, and at the end of the day, I feel pretty good about that. I never knew his name or why he fired his weapon at me instead of just walking out peacefully. He's probably in an unmarked grave somewhere in Michigan, and that doesn't bother me too much. I don't intend to end up like that man. Story 24. I grew up in some rough areas and was on the receiving end of 2 home invasions as a kid. However, it wasn't until Iraq that I had to shoot someone. I didn't get in country until 2004 after the invasion, but got stationed in Anbar, which sucked. Unlike the movies and firefights, now it's pretty common to not see your enemies get hit. I'd been in a few firefights at this point, but after 2 months, we were crossing a bridge and started taking fire from the opposite bank of the river. Saw a guy near one of the pylons shooting up at us, a terrible strategy, and put 3 rounds in him. He stumbled for a second, then dropped and bled out. Felt surreal after it happened, but now I don't think about it much. Dude shot at me first, and frankly, I'd have been happy to go my entire deployment without discharging a round. I have a lot of respect for that last statement. I'm always pretty unsettled when people sign up for stuff like the military and they clearly have the desire to shoot someone. I don't know how you can explain it, but there's a clear difference between someone who can and someone who wants to. And it just makes me really uncomfortable to think about. Getting into it for all the wrong reasons, I would say. Story 25. My story is really different from all these home invasion robberies. First, I was defending my girlfriend from what was not an immediate threat, but what I thought was an imminent threat. Second, I didn't take someone's life on purpose. Short version. When I finally confronted with a deeply heartfelt inquiry not by tough love or aggression, my high school sweetheart, who was 17 at the time, about her self-destructive behavior, she kind of had a sobbing breakdown and told me she had been assaulted by a family member starting when she was 5 years old. I wasn't sure if it had ended and didn't ask. I wanted to make sure it never happened again if it hadn't stopped, so I purchased a stolen handgun with the serial numbers ground off from someone at the street races. I later found the family member who my girlfriend had talked to me about and threatened him with the gun. Weeks later, long story short, he assaulted her, choked her out, and I happened to show up at her house just after it happened. I punched him in the head and it was never decided. Either there was a freak accident and an artery in his brain sort of tore, or when he fell and hit his head on the ground, that caused the tear in his brain. So directly or indirectly, it was my fault. Because of all the circumstances, I, a meek guy who had been physically abused by everyone from my father to bullies in elementary and middle school and who had never punched anyone in the face, ended up in county jail for a bit as things were sorted out, and then served 12 months for involuntary manslaughter in what was supposed to be a minimum security farm or camp, but the facility I went to also held more dangerous inmates. Did my girlfriend's family member dying mess me up? Not at all. It was an accident after all. What was scarring for me personally was the experience of everything. From my dad being ashamed and indescribably disappointed in me for doing what I did, through being locked up and picked on by so many other people. I didn't fit in because I wasn't a street kid at all. If you compare it to the movie Stand By Me, I was more like Will Wheaton's character, not River Phoenix's. So I was an easy target. I didn't come out tough or tattooed or badass, I just came out wounded inside. I had never been in any kind of trouble before then, and afterward I didn't get turned into a jail kind of guy. No one who knew me before it happened would have ever guessed I would experience what I did, and no one who has ever met me afterward would guess I had gone through it. I was, and still am, a very suburbia-type sensitive person who hates conflict and likes everyone to feel happy. I spent my whole life looking for a true friend of the kind I had in childhood, and to recover the high self-esteem I had as a young child. But for me, it's like I've gotten set further and further back. Everything was cool, and then first my dad, then bullies at school, then professional bullies, I guess. I've come a long way since then and grown a lot, but it would be great to have a best friend like I did in childhood. The kind of friend where you can hang out all day, riding bikes and doing anything, and just feeling like you're going on an adventure, where you both actually care about each other like siblings. Siblings you like. Anyway, that's my story. At least, my story this far. Still trying. To go from picked on suburbia boy to threatening someone with a gun is quite the leap, OP. That being said, I get it. Sounds like you're a very defensive and, as you said, sensitive person, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. The actual taking of his life was an accident, and I'm glad the court saw that. I'm very glad it wasn't more than 12 months for you. That being said, I wish you nothing but luck on the up and up. Godspeed, OP. Story 26. I work graveyards at a gas station in that gray part of town where a good neighborhood is immediately bordered by an extremely bad one. So I see all sorts of crap, both good and bad. A couple years ago, 4 or 5 now maybe, I usually try not to think about it. I was in the back room stalking and I hear the front door open. So I come out face first into 2 younger guys running in with guns drawn. I carry, but I'm not the kind of idiot who thinks he can draw, ready, aim, and fire before someone with a ready weapon ends my life. So I put my hands up and stop moving. Guy 1 keeps coming, grabs me by the back of the shirt, while Guy 2 peels off and starts grabbing all of the Newports and scratch tickets. Guy 1 puts the gun to the back of my head and brings me around to the register area. I open the register. He pulls me to the back of the register area by the cigarette display and his friend moves over to empty the till. While they're changing places, Guy 1 basically says to finish me off, and gestures with his gun in such a way that I got a good look at it. He had no mag. His friend may have, but he was facing away on one knee, with his weapon stuffed in his rear waistband with his freaking comically long shirt over it. Unfortunately for them, my CZ75 compact most certainly did. I smacked Guy 1 in the head with my right hand as hard as I could, and drew while shooting upwards at him. I wasn't really aiming, just fired twice in a center of mass from just above my hip. First round caught him in the upper sternum/collarbone area, and the second caught him in the base of the neck and traveled upwards through his skull, before finally ruining the Marlboro light display with bits of his head. Oddly, those cigarette cartons with the red on the white and gold are my clearest memory of that night. I spun towards Guy 2 and fired 3 more times, catching him once in the upper abdomen and twice in the chest. I immediately called 911 and then proceeded to sit on the floor in silence for the 10 minutes it took them to get there, shaking. After all, the adrenaline was wearing off. All said and done, I was questioned for about 20 minutes and my weapon was confiscated for the duration. But other than that and a month of nightmares, I was fine. Nightmares stopped once the detective in charge of the case let me know I wasn't the first store they'd robbed, and they had taken the lives of or severely beaten other checkers. Then I was just glad I'd removed trash like that from the world. Can't hurt anyone else now. Story 27. About 15 years ago, I was living in western US by myself and had just gotten an apartment about a week earlier. Nothing remarkable to speak of, neighborhood-wise. It wasn't great, but it wasn't awful either. Well, one night I'm laying in my bed trying to fall asleep, probably 1 a.m. or so, and I hear what I think is movement in the living room. I go, still listening carefully, and then I hear the sound of someone stumbling over one of the boxes still on my floor. Someone is in my apartment. I feel around for my knife, but remember I left it in the living room to cut open some packages. I don't know what to do. Lie and say I have a gun and hope he doesn't call my bluff? Charge out there like a wild man and hope he doesn't have a gun? Instead, I hope this person will realize I don't have anything and just leave. I get out of bed and slide behind the opposite side of the bed. Door was left open and opened out instead of in. My heart is beating so loud I'm having trouble hearing the intruder move. But then I see the slice of light coming into the room expand and I see a shadow. He is now entering the room. I quickly slide to the end of the bed in hopes of getting the jump on him. I see him go toward the bed with something in his hand, but I can't tell what, and I decide my best chance is to try and overwhelm him with violence. Here's where I should mention, especially since it became pertinent later, I was at the time an amateur heavyweight fighter, specialized in boxing but was in the state working with a university coach to learn wrestling. This guy is good-sized, but I tackle him into the nightstand and we fall to the floor. I recall him briefly on top in the scrum, but I quickly take top mount and absolutely unload punches and elbows. Whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 15 seconds. I turn on the light, see a gash on my elbow, and find a knife laying nearby. I kick it away. The intruder is out. There is a good amount of blood, and my end table is broken, and part of it is laying on him. Cheap target crap. I call the police and tell them what happened, but as my adrenaline is wearing off, I look at this dude and realize I screwed him up bad. I recall the moment I realized it, and I said to the dispatcher, I think he's dead. Turns out I'd basically crushed his skull and broke my hand, and he was probably dead before I stopped hitting him. What followed the next 2 years was pure hell. Unfortunately for me, I was white, and this what turned out to be 17-year-old kid was black. Media was all over it. Black teen beaten to death by white heavyweight fighter. Amazing how quickly the part of him breaking into my house with a freaking knife went away. Police had quickly decided no charges would be pressed against me, but the media circus created a lot of pressure, so I was brought in for more questioning. Local black leaders were saying it was murder and calling for my arrest, saying this was just a young man who made a bad decision and he didn't deserve to be murdered in cold blood. My work let me go. They were getting threatening calls. The coach I was working with said the university demanded he stop working with me because they didn't want the press saying he had trained me to end his life. I lost what little I had, and was having to couch surf with gym buddies and go out in hoodies so I wouldn't get spotted, because the freaking media had turned me into James Earl Ray and had turned this kid into Jesus. This went on for months. Luckily, a lawyer took on my case free of charge, and he was damned good. He did some digging, and it turned out the occupant of my apartment before was a 21-year-old girl who'd been stalked by this guy. She'd quit her job at the mall and broke lease to get away from him, but she was why he was there. She came forward and talked to the police, who were honestly good to me but were under insane pressure, and they formally dropped all charges. The media backed off for a bit at that point as well, but the black leadership wasn't done yet. They came out saying I was now trying to murder his character too, and then his freaking mom pressed a civil suit for wrongful death against me, seeking a $5 million settlement. It never made it to court, thank God, and I got the hell out of that state and moved somewhere where no one knew me, and I started going by my middle name. Long-term effects? Well, I left fighting right after. No state would ever sanction a fight for someone in my situation, even though I was cleared. Didn't struggle with PTSD from it or anything, but I do have some anger issues when people play the race card, and frankly, developed some hatred toward the media and black leadership. I also feel I lost empathy for people. What I dealt with robbed me of any faith in people, and that is something I struggle with. As someone who is self-admittedly very supportive of a lot of social movements, I do think it's very important to be careful who you make a martyr. In a case like this, diving in without knowing everything about it just doesn't really look good for anyone. It makes the social movement lose credibility, and it still simultaneously absolutely destroys the person who did it, I guess, OP in this case. I don't know specifically how the law works around break-ins, especially where OP is, and I know that in a lot of places you don't actually have the right to take someone's life just because they broke into your home. They have to pose a threat to you first. But even so, if someone breaks into your home, you see something in their hand, which OP later found out was a knife because they stabbed him, I think it's safe to say that he was in danger. And while my socially conscious self doesn't love how OP talked about the specifically quote-unquote black leadership in this post, it's hard for me to blame him, really. The hatred towards the media, though, I can absolutely get behind no matter what. The media sucks. And that's something I think is pretty universal. Story 28. It was my uncle when I was 16. My family was away on a final trip for my other uncle who was dying of cancer. He was my father's closest sibling, so they wanted to have one last trip. Anyway, my other scumbag uncle, who's a crackhead, thief, and a liar, broke into my house thinking we were all away. It was in broad daylight. People were wide awake, and he was smashing our dining room window. He was wearing a mask, which I guess was smart because we've got cameras in the house that we use when we go on trips. So I didn't know who he was when I shot him. I didn't know until the police arrived. He broke in and started walking upstairs towards all our bedrooms, and I shot him on the stairs and he fell down and died 2 hours later in the hospital. I don't feel bad for it. He was a scumbag. My cousin's childhood was fatherless because he spent it all in jail. When he got out of jail, he went back to the drugs and stole my cousin's Xbox, computer, and even tires off my cousin's car to sell for his drugs. His own son, and he was stealing from him to do drugs. Screw him. He had robbed our home before when I was very young. but I figured he had been smart enough to not do it again. He has stolen thousands of dollars from his own mother, who was still supporting him when I shot him, made her sell all the possessions left over from my grandfather to make sure he didn't land his butt back in jail, lawyers, car repairs, drugs, 100% supporting a 38-year-old man. No, I don't feel bad for it. I did momentarily when I learned who it was, but a few years after the fact, I did what I would have done to anybody who broke into my house at that time. Story 29. About 11 years ago, late 99, I was jumped by two guys at a small park in Whitney, Washington. It was 8:45 to 9 p.m. I had just gotten off work and was going to run a few laps to burn off some excess energy. The sun was just about to set as it was summertime, but there was a little bit of natural light left. The park was located on top of a plateau-type land formation, and there were only two ways in or out, the road leading up and a small dirt trail at the opposite end of the park. I had been there for about 15 or 20 minutes when I realized I was not only being watched by two men, I was being herded into a corner away from both exits. Initially, I told myself I was being paranoid. I picked up my pace in the direction of the dirt path, and that's when one of the guys started running at me. I knew crap was really going down. I started running full tilt toward the dirt path at the end of the park. Unfortunately, he had a good angle on me, and slammed into my hip/lower body and took me to the ground. At this point, my memory gets very hazy. The first guy who got to me was unarmed. We struggled on the ground for a few moments, years. One thing I remember specifically about this moment was that when you're in a life or death situation, all bets are off. I was scratching his face and gouging at his eyes and pulling his hair, basically just going absolutely ape to get away. Shortly after getting tackled, the second guy arrived and he was armed with a knife. I was still struggling with the first guy when I was stabbed a total of 3 times in the right thigh. I'm not sure if he didn't want to take my life or if he had poor aim, but I was fortunate I wasn't stabbed in the throat or stomach. The third time I was stabbed, I thrashed, and my second assailant lost hold of the knife. I picked it up on impulse and hit him with the butt of the knife in the temple repeatedly until he stopped moving. To be honest, my memory of actually ending his life is almost non-existent. It happened very quickly. His buddy booked it after his companion went down, and I was left at the park with 3 serious stab wounds and a body. This was before I had a cell phone. It was the 2 hours it took for me to get help that have stuck with me over the years. I remember being so scared I was going to jail, and being so scared the other guys were coming back. And overall, just being so freaking scared. At the end of the day, I don't regret what I did. I wasn't only threatened, I was actually attacked and wounded. I simply defended myself to the best of my abilities. The long-term damage mostly has to do with paranoia and concerns to being followed and watched. Story 30. Happened to me back in August. I was at work. An armed robber came in and robbed us at gunpoint and tied us up. Took my car keys, then he left. The screwed up thing is that he came back. When he came back, he didn't expect us to be free of our restraints, but we were. He leveled his gun at me, and for the first time in my life, I genuinely feared for my life. So I drew my concealed carry handgun and shot 4 times. Hit him twice, shoulder and lung. He never saw it coming until it was too late. It's been less than a year for me, and honestly, I'm fighting the urge to put that same gun to my head. I don't expect to be recovered from this soon. I don't really expect to ever be recovered. I'm 24 and I feel like my life is over because I took someone's life, because my options ran out. I would be dead if I hadn't shot. I never wanted to hurt someone, I just didn't want to be hurt. I didn't expect that the aftermath would hurt so much more, and so much longer, and so much worse. Now I'm a grade A basket case. I've been up for 3 days now because I can't sleep anymore. I can't let myself have dreams because they're always nightmares. I build models of planes and play WoW and binge watch season 3 of Orange is the New Black just to pass the time until I either break or die. Either way, that robber took my life. Just because a lot of people in this thread have said that they don't feel regret and that they weren't really that affected, I feel like it's important that I say or point out or whatever that OP being so affected does not make him weaker or less or whatever. Different people just react to things in different ways. You never know what's going to break a person or set a person off, really. And so just because OP isn't handling it as well, I guess, as the other posters, doesn't mean that people should look down on him. I don't know, it's just a worry I have. OP, I'm wishing nothing but the best for you. Story 31. This happened in December 2011. Back then I was living by myself in Brazil. Summer vacation had just started, and I had scheduled to go to a friend's house on the next Sunday. He lived about 2 kilometers away from me, so I would normally walk to his house. The city I was in is a dangerous city, but after a while you start to get the hang of when things are okay or not, which parts of the city you should really avoid, etc. However, on that Sunday, my street, a pretty big avenue that is generally pretty safe, was completely deserted. How deserted? I had to walk 2 blocks until I saw the first car. The guy was speeding and there were no shops open. Suddenly, a motorcycle with 2 guys stops just on the corner behind me, and one of the guys gets off and starts running towards me. Since I have some self-defense training, that jolted me into an alert state. I turned and quickly evaluated the situation. The guy running towards me had a handgun tucked into his pants, and the other one driving the motorcycle was outside my field of view, on the perpendicular street. I had with me my laptop, back then my most valuable possession. So when the guy said, "Give me your backpack," I threw a hammer fist to his neck and sprinted forward looking for a shop that would be open. I didn't stop to take a long look at the guy I hit, but he just fell on the ground on the spot. I don't know whether he lived or died. About 1.5 blocks away, I found a business building with 2 armed men guarding the entrance. They told me the police had been on strike, let me inside, and told me I had 20 minutes to have someone pick me up before the building closed. I desperately called my friend to pick me up by car, and that's about it. Did I ever recover psychologically? Well, after the whole thing, I threw up and was shaking too bad I couldn't do much for a while, although I guess that was from the fear and tension. I can't remember the robber's face, and maybe because there was no gore involved, it didn't really mess me up. Story 33. Many years ago, I was shot at while driving back from Cali to Texas. I was there because I got an awesome deal on a Caser compressor through auction, a little 411. Caser compressors are extremely well-built industrial compressors and very expensive. Anyway, after picking up the compressor, I filled up some gas and noticed a group of shady, tatted-up men staring at me. Not sure if these were the men involved, however, police and I thought that this is where I caught some negative attention. The place was in a low-income Mexican area of town, and I'm a white man from Texas. As the highway became more secluded, 2 men in a Honda Accord rolled up and waved me down. The passenger pointed a gun at me and told me to pull over. No, wasn't happening. Now, unfortunately, I was in California, not the great state of Texas. California has some very messed up gun laws, and criminals don't follow these gun laws. Weird, huh? If we had been in Texas where I left my guns, then the story would have already ended. After a few attempts to get me to pull over, the passenger shot at me through my window. I slammed my truck into the side of their car, sending them flying into the guardrail. I've never seen such weird feats of physics. The way that car spun around in the air and wrapped itself around the rail still amazes me. Looked unreal. Literally pieces of their car were landing in front of me and hitting my truck when I was hundreds of feet in front of them. The accident ended up taking both of their lives. The rail cut the driver right in half. I really don't feel bad at all. If you are going to hurt or take the life of me or a loved one, I wouldn't spare a microsecond in putting you down, and I definitely wouldn't spend time regretting it. Story 34. I work the night shift, so I normally get home around 1 to 1:30 a.m., and most times my mother is asleep by this time. However, I could see the living room lights were on, and 2 big shadows were moving around in my house. This was extremely out of the ordinary, so I unclipped my Smith & Wesson from my holster and slowly peeked in through a window. There were 2 guys in their mid-40s in my living room throwing things around and rummaging through drawers. One man had a handgun, and I figured I could wait and call the police from outside the house and keep an eye on them, making sure they don't head for the bedrooms on the 2nd floor. However, when I glanced to the couch, I saw my mother huddled with my 12-year-old niece who must have been spending the night. I knew if I waited for the cops, this could go south before they got there. I was able to signal my mother to cover my niece's eyes and ears. I waited till the 2 men were on the far side of the room. I turned the doorknob and burst into the house with my weapon pointed at the man with the pistol. I told him in a commanding sort of voice to drop his weapon. Then it happened in slow motion, it felt. I saw his arm start to flick upward, and I fired 3 rounds into center mass. The second man reached behind his back, and I had no choice but to put 4 rounds into him too. What I can tell you is it's not like the movies where a person dies instantly. In real life, people gurgle, cry, ask for family members, ask why you did it, so on. The way I see it is I took these people's lives, and by doing so, I prevented the deaths of others who may have run into them if I did nothing. The sheepdog analogy seems to work pretty well. If I didn't make the choice to pull the trigger, my life would have been lost along with my family. Story 35. When I was 19, about 3 years ago, I was at a dealer's house buying weed. His house is in a real sketchy area, but it's close to mine, so I walk there whenever I need to. When I left his house, I was walking home, and then these 3 guys, the oldest couldn't have been more than 18, came out from behind a building, and one was aiming a gun at me. They told me that they knew where I was coming from and to hand over everything I had. I was scared crapless, so I gave them my phone, wallet, and weed. 2 of the guys then booked it, but one stayed. He wasn't the guy with the gun. He pulled out a knife and said, "Sorry about this, man, but you saw my face," and then ran at me. Without thinking, I pulled the knife out of my pocket and lunged at him. He cut my arm open, but my knife was fully lodged in his stomach. I fell backwards, then scrambled to get off the street out of view. I was scared crapless. I called 911 and told them everything that happened. Within 5 minutes, which felt like an hour, police and an ambulance were there. The kid was taken to a hospital where he died that night. I cried into the officer's jacket who was questioning me. That officer told me it was either me or him and that I made the right choice. Those words helped me get through most of it. I still think about it a lot, but I don't regret it anymore. I did what I had to do. That was our last story for the day. I don't really have many closing remarks for this sort of topic. It was a pretty heavy thread, and as such, as I like to do, I encourage you all to take some time for yourselves and just decompress for a bit. At the very least, though, I hope you found it interesting. I also hope you have a wonderful day or night wherever you are, and I will see you in the next one.